Hello, welcome back to Am I Neurodivergent, chapter 29 of 52. I'm Struan, late diagnosed autistic and ADHD, and this video series is a weekly recap of my neurodivergent discovery year with new episodes every Sunday, understanding and reframing the way I think about myself and my brain. When I finally realised I was neurodivergent, I found it very difficult to know where to start processing all the new information I was only just realising was out there for the first time. And like I've said in the comments for recent videos, my hope is that by bringing all of my thoughts from that first year together in one video series and leaving it out there, it might help out others who might be going through a similar journey and help pave the way through that initial adjustment maybe a bit easier. For this week, chapter 29, I realise I've talked quite a bit about masking in a number of these videos, but I've never actually done a specific episode on it, despite intending to do it as one of my earliest ones. This is going to be a longer one, and some of it probably repeats a few things I've dropped in previous videos, like there's particularly quite a bit of crossover probably with the chapter I did on fawning, but I do think it's worth having a chapter specifically on this, what it is, why we do it, and whether trying to stop doing it is a healthy thing or an unhealthy thing, as it's one of the key things to try to understand as you move from one way of seeing yourself to the next, particularly after getting a late diagnosis. It's also one of the key behaviours we adopt that can lead to autistic burnouts and mental health issues, compounding over time, the longer we have to or that we choose to do it. Masking and mimicking neurotypical behaviour for most of us that have done it is and has been absolutely exhausting. Masking is essentially the coping strategies we develop, consciously or unconsciously, to hide our autistic traits and to get by and fit in with the neurotypical world. Most of us realise pretty early on that we're a bit different to most other people. Some of us lean into that and embrace it. Others try really hard to observe and learn and try to mimic what seems to be normal, and essentially try, consciously or unconsciously, to appear non-autistic. Generally, this starts pretty young, to not get bullied at school for being weird. These strategies have come to be known as masking, or sometimes also camouflaging or adaptive morphing. It's become a bit of a trope that autistic girls and women do this much more and much better than men, which is why autistic girls and women tend to get missed much more than boys and men. And this is demonstrably true, but it's no longer seen as a neat absolute line in the sand by any stretch anymore. And it's wrong to say as a blanket statement that autistic girls mask their traits and autistic boys don't. Autism's a spectrum condition, and reactive coping strategies are rarely black and white, one or the other, sort of box A or box B. I've said in a previous video, one of my earliest therapists, after self-diagnosing, said I'd masked much more like a girl than a boy, but many of the late diagnosed men I've spoken with since starting these videos have done this too, even though it is way more common with women. There's a whole other video I'm probably going to try and do, hopefully with some help from other voices, on intersectionality and how much harder it becomes for women, minorities, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, people with comorbidities, to get an ASD diagnosis. Basically, the further away from straight white male and middle class you get, the harder everything becomes. My privilege in getting an ASD diagnosis fully acknowledges these difficulties. On autistic masking as a topic, like I said, I suspect there's more crossover than we think, but that said, for this video, I'm going to use my notes from a fantastic book talking about masking specifically from a female autistic perspective. Just because I read it, a hell of a lot of it chimed for me, and she explains it all better than I could ever do, and with a considerable amount more authority as an autistic advocate and researcher who completed a PhD in camouflaging mental health and late diagnosis in autistic females. The book's called Taking Off the Mask by Dr. Hannah Louise Belcher. And this week's episode is pretty much going to be me summarising my notes from this book, and there were a lot, and throwing the odd boy-dog reflection in there as well from my own perspectives. The book's divided up into 5 main chapters, which I'm going to broadly stick to. The first is titled Learning to Imitate, and Hannah talks about trying to work out why, when she was diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum in her 20s, had not a single teacher, psychiatrist, or psychologist made the connection between her mental health struggles and autism. She says it wasn't as if she hadn't strongly displayed autistic symptoms. She had been a very anxious child, had a strong aversion to certain textures and foods, and had to drop out of school at 14 due to stress. But while she had been at school, she'd performed well academically, had lots of friends, and was known to have a good sense of humour. She internalised all her struggles while looking for all intents and purposes normal, all sounding massively familiar to me so far. She talks about her eventual light bulb moment and realising that as she grew up, because she'd never felt normal but wanted desperately to fit in, she'd watched and mimicked the behaviours of others, from friends and family to fictional TV and book characters, and adopted their traits as her own. She'd observed and learned how to make and sustain eye contact, how to add intonation to her speech, how to move her hands and body to express herself by matching them with her words, and add in specific phrases, conversation starters, and appropriate facial reactions. Hannah was, in short, really good at masking her autism, what can sometimes be called high masking. She's also done a lot of peer research and pulls in the experiences of others, so it's not just her voice. A testimonial from a man called Thomas, who didn't get a diagnosis until his 50s, really struck me. The quote is, I was unaware I had any autistic traits. I just knew that I was different and uncomfortable, and did my best to act in the same way as those around me, so as not to draw attention to myself. He says he constantly feels like an intruder in the living room of a nice family he hardly knows. The family are having some kind of social get-together, and he's being as pleasant as he can to fit in and not upset their evening, but he just doesn't belong there. Thomas went on to drink heavily to cope with social pressures, as many autistic people do. Hannah talks about her own initial childhood masking, becoming unconscious, being unconscious, but as she got older, it became more of a conscious thing, even before she knew she was masking. She'd know when to turn on her camouflaged self in public to be the person others expect her to be. And she talks about, whether we like it or not, humans from the earliest hunter-gatherer days are fundamentally a social race of creatures. This is by way of saying everyone masks and camouflages to a certain degree. Everyone acts in ways to meet others' expectations within a wider social group, and hide the aspects of ourselves we think others won't like, to not be rejected by the tribe and cast out. These behaviours start in all humans from infancy. However, she goes on to say that the extent of masking and camouflaging required by autistic people to not only appear non-autistic, but also to appear desirable and to fit into different groups in different contexts is next level exhausting compared to the kind of minor course correction baseline masking and camouflaging that non-autistic people do. She talks about the shame of having got stuff wrong in social situations, driving the need to mask and mimic and practice to do better, as well as the buzz that forming social connections and bonds with people create that non-autistic people take for granted. For autistic and neurodivergent people, forming these bonds and connections with other people, like a partner or a best friend, can be incredibly rare, and sadly for many, often never experienced at all. It can be a lonely life. And a lot of people camouflage for so long, it becomes difficult to know where the mask ends and the real you begins. I actually think when you're super late diagnosed, there almost is no dividing line anymore. You're just you at this point, which I've said previously. I think that's part of the grief you can feel with a late diagnosis, not knowing who you might have potentially been if you hadn't chiseled all your neurospicy edges off to try to be more like everyone else. It's super sad to think about. She closes the opening chapter by reiterating, as we already looked at in the Understanding Autism videos that I did, that the old trope about autistic people lacking empathy is BS, and that research is increasingly showing that neurodivergent people can empathise with the distress of others, often too much, and basically have to switch the empathy off to survive and not be overwhelmed by it, which can be another form of masking. Louise says she spent 30 years and a PhD in psychology studying non-autistic people to understand them better, yet can't convince some work colleagues to even watch a 1-hour tutorial on how to work with an autistic colleague who lacks empathy in this scenario. It's a big reason why we mask, because people can be fucking cruel and disinterested in difference. Hannah's second chapter is called The Drive to Camouflage, and it talks about while pretty much all humans mimic and imitate their peers in the early years, for the majority of people that peters out as they pass adolescence and become more comfortable in their skin and in social situations. For many autistic people, though, the instinct never becomes second nature as we become teenagers and adults, and the need to closely observe others' behaviour in order to get it right never passes. The University of Kent course that I talked about previously describes it as like living in a different culture with a different language and different customs every day, and never feeling like it's your natural home. She mentions the CAT-Q test that was developed for high masking autistic adults a few years back now, for adults who have always struggled but perhaps don't score as highly as they might think on the AQ test I've linked to previously. I'll link the CAT-Q test, which stands for Camouflaging Autistic Traits Questionnaire, in the description below for people to take. I should have done that before now, actually. I mentioned way back at the start of these that I scored high but not off the charts high on the AQ test. I do score off the charts high on the CAT-Q test, so this is another interesting one for people who are on the fence about whether or not they're on the spectrum after a lifetime of masking. Studies have also shown that the higher people score on the CAT-Q for camouflaging autistic traits, the worse they score for traits of anxiety, depression and suicide risk, because you're basically suppressing your identity and living inauthentically, which has such a horrendous effect on your self-worth. Like pretty much everything else autism related, masking or camouflaging is a spectrum, and an individual's use of compensation to make up for perceived impairments can run, as Hannah puts it, shallow or deep. The example she uses is learning to laugh at the end of structured jokes. Someone tells you that you don't find funny as shallow compensation, while doing a deep dive to research and understand the mechanisms of structured jokes and why people find humour in things you don't being deep compensation. Counting the seconds of eye contact before looking away to appear normal is shallow compensation. Learning, studying and observing facial expressions to understand how different emotions are understood to be conveyed through facial expressions, and practicing until it becomes almost second nature to you. Practicing conversation scripts and observed behaviours to deploy at the right time in social situations to assimilate, etc., is deep compensation. As Hannah says, it's a balancing act that requires years of practice. None of us wake up one morning at 4 years old and decide we're going to get along better with our friends if we flap our hands less and copy their facial expressions more. It just happens. But it never stops taking energy and effort for us. She notes that more girls are missed because they tend to internalise their struggles, becoming anxious and mute, whereas most boys tend to externalise their struggles, often becoming hyperactive and vocal. A lot of this is to do with how boys and girls tend to be socialised from an early age into gender norms, at least in the Western world. This is thankfully changing somewhat now, but for a long time, boys were expected to be independent, dominant, aggressive. Girls expected to be shy, compassionate, and sympathetic to others' needs. How many autistic girls and women, she wonders, will remember being told, be more ladylike, to dress nicely, to be less loud and boisterous when they were young. Girls tend to be pushed more than boys to fit in more socially, to be quiet, to be more empathetic. These are obviously very simplified gender norms that are being discussed, and it's in part been an overcompensation, rightly so, against autism being seen as a male condition. It's not a male condition. Girls and women just tend to present differently. But as with all things autism related, thankfully newer research is starting to become more nuanced and look at gender norms as a spectrum, rather than a male brain and a female brain, not to mention non-binary, LGBTQ plus or asexual neurodivergent people, quite a high overlap actually, and how societal expectations have thrown them even more hurdles to trip over in terms of what's expected of them than autistic people, at least comfortable in their gender and sexuality. It goes back to that intersectionality I talked about. The more quote-unquote different you are from the stereotyped baseline, the harder all this becomes to find your place in the world and feel like you belong. But whatever the rationale or the rights and wrongs of societal gender expectations, research does bear out that autistic women are by and large significantly better at masking and camouflaging than autistic men, and therefore get missed more. And hopefully that changes the more understanding and nuance comes to educators, healthcare providers, therapists, counsellors, mental health support, etc., etc. I'd even go so far as to say the very first and most important question that should be asked whenever anyone's having behavioural or mental health challenges is, could they be neurodivergent? But it isn't. Often the people who should be asking those questions don't even really understand what neurodivergence is. Like, find your empathy, neurotypical world, and learn to understand this stuff better. Please. Hannah talks a bit about executive function, transitions, and procrastination, which I talked about last week, so I won't regurgitate again here. But broadly, executive function, so multitasking, planning and sequencing our thoughts and actions, and overcoming cognitive overwhelm, are again all big challenges most of us face. Guess what requires a lot of executive function? Masking requires a lot of executive function, and guess why so many of us spend so much time exhausted? Because so much of our mental energy is spent on masking and camouflaging that we have so little energy left for anything else. A post-work pint at the pub with colleagues is a pleasant diversion for most neurotypical people. For autistic people, when we can't get out of it, probably finishes us off after an already exhausting day and takes our spoons from zero down into negatives. Like, who else gets back home after a social event and immediately has to go straight to bed or just lie on the couch like a zombie until you're recovered? Broadly not neurotypicals, it turns out. Studies show the better you are with executive function on the spiky profile spectrum color wheel of strengths and deficits, the better at masking and camouflaging you tend to be. The final drive for masking Hannah talks about here is shame and stigma. She writes very movingly about her greatest fear being embarrassing herself or others seeing her out of control, her social performance slipping and people seeing her having a panic attack, crying, getting angry, or just saying something other people think is odd. If someone tells her something she said has upset them or was inappropriate in some way, she feels internally crippled with embarrassment and shame, and she still has traumatic flashbacks to things she said years ago that weren't appropriate or people thought were weird. I massively relate to all of this, I imagine. A lot of us do. So we mask to avoid making these faux pas over and over again. It's why so many autistic people also have massive social anxiety. She cites a study that concluded many autistic people aren't just shy in social situations, they acutely fear them. And other studies show most autistic adults will have been bullied when they were kids. I was on a few occasions, but not in the systemic way a lot of neurodivergent kids can be, which I also saw happen. Not only by kids, by the way, but also by teachers. People smell difference and they go for it. Like, educate, educate, educate. No kids are born bullies. You change input, you change output. And fucking discipline and sack teachers who mock and victimize the weird kids, by the way. There was a high school English teacher I had who routinely mocked and belittled someone who was clearly, in retrospect, on the autism spectrum. They were quite a celebrated teacher too at the time, but in retrospect, just a small, mean, insecure man. You're supposed to educate and empower kids, not mock them and make them feel less than their peers. Just awful looking back. Anyway, stay on topic. There's so much unconscious bias in non-autistic people as a default setting. It's really disheartening. Hannah mentions research done where autistic and non-autistic people were asked to audition for a reality show, and a non-autistic audience were asked to rate their impressions. The autistic applicants were found to be more socially awkward and less likable. Is it any wonder so many of us mask? Educate, educate, educate. Like, when society becomes more tolerant and more accepting of human variance, these biases will evaporate. Different isn't less than, different is different. But what's easier, to turn the entire tanker of human society around to be more tolerant and accepting of difference, or just tell one weird kid to act more normal? But it's not one weird kid, is it? It's millions of weird kids. And we're plenty normal and plenty empathetic. And the more of us speak up and normalise difference, the more weight gets pushed on that tanker to turn itself around and change course. Because it ain't going to do it if no one pushes it. I talked about autistic inertia last time. Like, try neurotypical society inertia. That's what needs fucking help with transitions. Sorry, I'm really chippy today. People are going to tell me off for not being nice enough to the normies. Nice normies, you get a pass. I know there's a ton of neurotypical allies out there fighting the fight for a more understanding world alongside us, and thank you. It's obviously not just changing the neurotypical world, it's also creating space where neurodivergent people can find each other more easily. I talked previously about the double empathy theory that Damien Milton's written and talked about. Neurodivergent people get each other in ways that neurotypical people, broadly speaking, don't. And while neurodivergent people do tend to gravitate towards one another, even when we don't know we're neurodivergent, a lot of us get caught in a kind of lonely, self-imposed exile. And there's got to be ways of lessening that and enabling us to find each other and bounce ideas off each other and compare notes and strategies more easily. And crucially, not mask, just be our weird, wonderful, random selves and not care about judgment or getting it wrong. Hannah talks about the toll masking took on her at school and university, shutting herself away in toilet cubicles, going off sick, being unable to leave the house, having what she now knows to be autistic burnouts. She was referred to mental health services and collected diagnoses of depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and bipolar, but no one was seeing the autism. No one was seeing the neurodivergence, despite all the signs being right there in plain sight. She talks about going to university and consciously getting rid of all the childish things that brought her comfort that wouldn't be considered normal or cool by her peers, replacing them with posters and indicators she knew were cool that would make her fit in, but in doing so, losing herself, forgetting who she was and what she enjoyed. And part of her recovery from her mental health breakdown was reconnecting with all of the things, the toys, the TV shows, the clothes, the music that made her happy, and relearning how to be her authentic and happier self. Again, recognize all this. Whenever I've had what I now know to be burnouts, I heavily retreat back into like pro wrestling and comic books and Star Trek, the stuff I loved when I was a kid. One of those bits of scripture that's bled into the collective consciousness is, when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. Like, yeah. Childish things are fine, comfort's fine. How about judge not lest you be judged? That's some main character wisdom. Just embrace whatever gives you shelter from the storm. Anyway, it's a weird cul-de-sac. I've gone down. Chapter 3 in the book is Do You Camouflage? And it turns the focus from the author's experience to the experiences the reader may have had or be having. And she stresses the book and the concept of unmasking is not about taking away coping strategies that give a person confidence, but rather identifying behaviours and situations that might negatively affect a person's well-being. She stresses that masking and camouflaging is not done to quote-unquote trick others. It's an individual trauma response to social stressors you did to make yourself feel safer, and masking will often have led to positive things in autistic people's lives also. Masking is not necessarily a quote-unquote bad thing to stop doing. She talks about as a child her mother pushing her into play dates with other kids that she didn't enjoy but would never have initiated on her own, and it allowed her to observe how non-autistic kids socialised and interacted with each other, and how non-autistic people don't really like one-way monologues and prefer two-way conversations, something she still struggles with. She learned just enough eye contact to not be seen as weird. Studying human behaviour and working out systems became a hyper-focus for her. She learned that humour was the key to getting people to like her, and developed sarcasm as a second language, which I also did quite early on. Even though she'd hide in her room at university and be racked with social anxiety, she made enough friends to get her through her course, graduate and go on to do a PhD, and even get relatively confident with public speaking. The book prints out the CAPQ, Camouflaging Autistic Traits Self-Questionnaire, in full, which again I'll link to. Some examples of the kind of questions it asks you to grade your responses against are: when you're interacting with someone, do you deliberately copy their body language or facial expressions, monitor your own body and facial reactions to appear relaxed, feel the need to act or perform as normal to get through social situations? Have you developed a script to draw from in social situations, repeat phrases verbatim you've heard others say, or mimic behaviours you've learned from watching others? Are you always thinking about the impressions you're making on other people? Do you need the support of others to force yourself to socialise? Do you practice facial expressions and body language to check they look natural and that you appear interested and engaged? Do you have to force eye contact? Do you actively look for ways to avoid interacting with others at social occasions? Hello, smoking. If you've ever researched rules and tips for better social interactions, if you consciously use body language and facial expressions you've picked up from watching films or TV, and the extent conversations flow naturally when you're talking to others. Some of the questions kind of repeat themselves, or reverse themselves to ensure consistent answers. Scores range from 25 to 175, and while there's no cut-off point, scores over 100 indicate strong social camouflaging. The book also notes the average scores for men and women, both autistic and non-autistic. Interestingly, non-autistic women score lowest, then non-autistic men, then autistic men, then autistic women score highest, which does back up the point that autistic women do learn to mask more. The rest of the chapters are around trying to parse which masking strategies make us as individuals feel better and more confident, and which ones shred us, drain all our spoons, and make us feel like shit. She goes into CBT techniques like the thought and behaviour cycle, but does make note of the fact that CBT and how certain situations can make us feel is quite problematic for a lot of autistic people because of alexithymia, which a lot of us have. I'm going to do a whole video on this at some point. Alexithymia is the difficulty in identifying and describing emotions, which makes CBT quite tricksy. It can work if you have a therapist or coach who knows what they're doing and knows how to work through this, but that doesn't always happen. Anyway, she goes through some workbook exercises asking the reader to identify a recent situation where they've camouflaged, reflect on what they were thinking at the time, what feelings they experienced, what, if any, bodily sensations they experienced, and how you reacted as the situation went on. It encourages you to do these exercises over a period of time and notice when your reactions might vary and reflect on why and how you can potentially use these reflections to turn negative masking experiences into more positive masking experiences. Chapter 4 in the book is how to be self-compassionate, and is centered around managing overwhelming feelings and practicing self-compassion to reduce anxiety and depression. I'm glad Hannah says the words self-compassion and mindfulness are big turn-offs for her, because they are for me as well. I was never interested, after self-diagnosing, in being kinder to myself. I just wanted to be better at things and more productive than I was. Thinking about being kinder to myself felt self-indulgent and a waste of time. I was in such an entrenched place of berating myself to do better and be better. And it was reassuring to hear Hannah say it can actually be the hardest skill to acquire after years of masking and feeling angry with yourself. We need to stop treating ourselves differently to others. Like, would we furiously yell at a friend for a slight social faux pas they felt mortified over? Of course not. So why do it to ourselves? Because the more we've negatively masked, the worse our mental health and self-esteem will have gotten. And it can become a cycle where the more anxiety we feel, the more we mask, the more we feel shame, and the more anxious and depressed we get still. Being upfront and open about your differences and challenges is one of the key things to getting out of this shame and anxiety cycle. And this can be a huge barrier to cross for many of us. When we fight so hard to get things right, any perceived slight or criticism sits with us insanely heavily. We don't want to show we feel angry with others over not thinking about our needs as much as we're thinking about theirs. That would be letting the mask slip. So the anger just internalizes against ourselves. When we mask, we can basically spend our lives putting others' feelings and reactions above our own by trying to please and appease others and be seen as useful. I covered similar ground to this in the autistic fawning video I did in chapter 19. And the more we do this, the worse our mental health gets. We can't change what others think about us, no matter how hard we try. We can only change how we think about ourselves. But we all too often don't listen to ourselves and what our inner GPS is telling us what we need, let alone reflect deeply on how to meet those needs. And because we're not listening to the one voice that matters, ours, we constantly second guess what we've said and done in relation to how other people may or may not have interpreted what we said and did. Hannah calls these our automatic thoughts. It's exhausting and basically a pointless endeavour. And the rest of this chapter leans quite heavily into CBT and thinking errors, all the different facets of negative self-talk we fall into that reinforce the negative feelings we have about ourselves. That's the whole, that first step to solving a problem is acknowledging you have a problem thing. And the book leans into noticing your negative thinking patterns whenever you have triggering thoughts that cause you anxiety. There's workbook tables and guides in the book for replacing the negative thoughts you have in situations with more aspirational, positive, kinder, more compassionate thoughts towards yourself, and better ways you could have framed whatever the interaction was, comparing the automatic negative thought with the new positive thought in each instance. She stresses this is a long game and not something that can be done overnight. And yeah, people can spend years in therapy trying to unpick these negative automatic thoughts. It's not a finger snap. But if you've never thought about this stuff, the book walks you through it in quite a useful, concise way where you can go at your own pace and not burn through money on endless weekly therapy sessions, which is always a plus. This stuff is particularly difficult for people who experience negative emotions or feelings of rejection particularly acutely, because there's a tendency to veer away from or suppress feelings of distress or overwhelm and not dive into it to explore why it's happening, which stops you from ever reframing it. you just avoid the intensity and push it down and then internalize it all instead. And this is called low distress tolerance, and it's basically going into emotional shutdown. It's also doubly hard with alexithymia, where you can't really identify or describe the feelings to even start to get under the skin of them. The book has another table on how intolerable certain emotions can feel and what you were thinking as you start to observe them. It's not mentioned in the book, but I'm also going to throw in a link in the description with what's known as the feelings wheel, which I found really helped with alexithymia and CBT in terms of just being able to identify with specificity the things that cause you distress. I've absolutely pushed stuff down and ignored it because dealing with it felt too overwhelming. I'll be honest, the book did feel like it was slightly veering away from autistic masking and moving into kind of cookie cutter anxiety therapy at this point, but it does pull back and tie it all off into negative masking experiences that cause us distress because we feel upset at acting inauthentically. And it is all super related, and I can see now, rereading some of this, that it's maybe not all quite as insurmountable as it can seem, a lot of this stuff. There's a core of basic work to do, and it is work, but flipping the narrative you hold about yourself and feeling healthier mentally is fundamentally a similar route through the trees a lot of times, whatever your individual starting point. It's not about fixing yourself, it's about clearing the undergrowth and weeds away that have stopped you getting the light you need to nourish your mind and thoughts and let those shine in the way they've probably not been able to for a long time. And the only way through distress intolerance is accepting and acknowledging the distress instead of pushing it down, observing the feeling as if it's a train passing through your brain station, and not fearing its presence, understanding why the distressing feeling's coming to you, breathing through it, and knowing that it will leave again. It takes a lot of practice to start feeling comfortable with negative thoughts. I can tell you, again, it's not a finger snap. It takes longer to work through these CBT techniques when you're autistic, and I'm glad Hannah makes this specific point, because I think a lot of autistic people get frustrated with CBT when it doesn't immediately work. You can't just face your fear and social anxiety by tackling it head on when you also suffer with sensory overwhelm, for example. The changes have to be very incremental and only at a pace that the person going through the distress tolerance levels is absolutely comfortable with. And identifying comforts that bring distress levels down when they start to spiral. And that can sometimes be a painfully slow process. You need a therapist or guide who really understands autism with the additional challenges with change that brings. Hence, I guess, why doing it at your own pace with this book could actually be advantageous. But doing all this without a guide takes a lot of willpower and self-motivation. You have to want it. And sometimes just wanting to be left alone can be more powerful than that, and that's okay too. There's no demand on anyone to do this, no demand to change your thought patterns or self-talk. Hannah's book's just someone shining a torch through the trees and saying, hey, look at all that unhelpful foliage. She talks a bit about mindfulness and acknowledges how a lot of us can have difficulties with the abstract nature of it. I certainly did and still do. She makes the case for it being a huge help with anxiety reduction and takes you through some breathing and grounding and meditation exercises. To be fair, I do the safe space place when I'm having trouble sleeping and picture myself in a place where I felt completely calm and free from worries and external threat. I've done this for years and it does help me drift off to sleep. I just didn't realize it was mindfulness and could be done when not wanting to sleep, just wanting to feel calm. Keeping a daily diary of achievements in one column and things you struggled with in another is another good way of maintaining perspective and seeing the good of a day can often outweigh the bad, or writing down 3 things you're looking forward to each morning, which can be super mundane, but help with acknowledging the small wins of a day, turning down your threat levels, and learning to self-soothe mentally and be less self-critical all the time, retrain your brain from essentially attacking itself. Finally, chapter 5 is taking off the mask and really pulls all this together, looking at ways to safely not mask autistic traits and feel comfortable doing so, and feel comfortable discovering or rediscovering activities you can't enjoy anymore because of the toll that your masking takes. She reiterates it's completely fine to want to mask and be fine with it because it provides confidence and makes experiences more positive, and that's fine. This is just for those who find masking exhausting and draining and want to feel more free in their everyday interactions. Finding other autistic people and autistic spaces can be a key part of this, that safe space for just being you and openly discussing your challenges rather than hiding them. Once you become comfortable discussing all this with others like you, it can make it easier to discuss your quote-unquote real self with neurotypicals and not feel any of that shame or judgment you may fear. Hannah talks about late diagnosis often being accompanied by a realization you don't really know what you like or what you enjoy anymore. With high masking, life has become a series of shoulds. You do things you feel you should be doing rather than things you want to do, from career to friendships to hobbies and interests. You're living a life, maybe externally very successfully, but you've potentially not been living your life. And again, she talks readers through a series of practical exercises, including thinking back through your life to a time you felt happiest, describing it, what it was you liked about it, what activities you liked doing, what you did to calm yourself down if you were feeling upset or overwhelmed, which could well be stimming, the repetitive movements and sounds that a lot of us do. If your happiest time was during childhood, rediscover some of those childhood hobbies or games or toys or comics that brought you joy. There's absolutely no shame in that. Hannah's very firm that being autistic is not a disorder, and that the flapping or rocking or twitching or muttering that soothed you in your younger days is not something to have squashed out of you to be more normal as an adult. All that's done is removed coping mechanisms and left you more vulnerable to anxiety and stress. Reclaim the things that calm and soothe you and be unapologetic about them. Guilt and shame-free contentedness that regulates you. What concept. Your childhood or adolescent obsessions and interests are okay to reopen. Many of us have probably kept at least some of them going, possibly secretly, if they'd be seen as weird or odd things for adults to still be fascinated with. Legos and train sets are the stereotypical male version of these, but it can be anything from scrapbooks to collecting things to drawing and painting to systematizing information and keeping databases to arranging shells. Whatever brings you joy and comfort, own it. It's you. Why put that in a drawer and pretend it's not? The next step is proudly talking about these niche hobbies and interests you have. Who cares if you get the odd judgmental comment about them being childish or weird? That's their reaction. It's nothing to do with you. For all we know, they could be jealous that you're being the unmasked you, and they're having to squash down their own authentic self and feel a kind of resentment towards how free and real you're being about yourself. You can tell people you're autistic or not tell people you're autistic. That's entirely up to you. But you can stop hiding who you are and what makes you happy. People often also delight in eccentricities and find them fascinating and want to know more, which is win-win. We get to info dump about a passion project and not feel like we're making an idiot of ourselves. And again, even if we are, who cares? If someone's judgy, then they're not your friend, and there's plenty who would be. I hadn't realized at the time, but reading all this, I'd actually started unmasking almost immediately after getting my diagnosis in terms of talking about it. Probably too much and oversharing, like with friends. For me, it felt like the cork coming out of a bottle. I think I'd masked extensively for years and years and years. And then after I had my stress breakdown and got that initial ASD diagnosis, I just unmasked really quickly from one extreme to the other. Maybe even overcompensating, kind of ripping the band-aid off, and was just like, right, this is me now, guys. This has always been me, even though I've never mentioned it before. And all of this is just really hard for me. And I've talked in previous videos about people not really being bothered in any way and just being quite curious. Like, as much as anything else, like what feels like a massive deal for you really isn't for other people. People think about us a lot less than we've assumed, and realizing that is quite liberating. But what's also clear from this book and all the testimonials in it is that unmasking can be incredibly difficult for lots of people, particularly in coming to terms with a late diagnosis, and that reframing. In work situations too, if you don't tell people what you need, they're not going to know what you need. If you unmask and say, you know what, I struggle with A, B, and C, so having X, Y, and Z would really help me do my job better, more often than not always, I'm very aware, but more often than not, the person is just going to say, like, okay, let's see. Fuck. That's good. Hey, just spilled water everywhere. What's I talking about? Work. Recruitment and retention rates in employment for autistic people are shockingly low. I've talked about this in the past, but it's only by putting our heads above the parapet and talking about being open and talking about our challenges and how employers can remove barriers to empower us and allow us to shine that we will shine. This is something I'm really trying to do in my own workplace at the moment, and feel unashamed of saying what I think is needed, not just for my situation, but in terms of organisational change. I'm just in full IDGAF mode right now. Let's see where it leads. It's about unmasking as much as you feel comfortable with in different areas of your life, and just not pretending you're not autistic. That's all unmasking is. Stopping trying to pretend you're not autistic. Again, Hannah has a series of practical experiments around gradually unmasking and asking a friend to observe your behaviour and give their reflections on how they and others perceived you. It's often way more positively and way less negatively than you anticipate. But again, go at your own pace if you're nervous. You don't owe anyone anything. This is about you being more comfortable just being you in the real world. She gives a real world example of a friend asking her to go to a gig, her not wanting to go, but thinking if she says no, her friend will think she's boring and never ask her to anything ever again. She tests her reaction by sending a text and saying she enjoys spending time with her friend but doesn't feel she wants to go to the gig as she'd find it a bit much. She feels insanely anxious and keeps checking her phone for a response, like the friendship will be over. Instead, her friend just says no worries, and they end up grabbing some food and watching a film instead. It turns out setting boundaries are fine. Saying what you're comfortable with and not comfortable with is fine. People will still like you because you're likable for being you. Right, that's pretty much it. And that said, I'm going to finish by being a bit real and saying that I mask a hell of a lot in these videos, quite a bit more than is maybe apparent. I was talking to another content creator, Jen from Neurodivergent, and she said the way I could just talk off the cuff was really impressive. I do not talk off the cuff with these videos. I put a ton of work into them, not in editing and putting in effects and cuts and graphics and music and whatnot. Like, obviously I'm lazy as hell at all that visual stuff, but in terms of preparing what I want to talk about each week, scripting, going through my old journals and emails, trying to create a through line of sorts, double checking information, refinding pages I visited a year and a bit ago to get links to put in the description, practicing my points. If I were to just switch on my webcam and try to talk about autism, I would just go like, autism's hard, right? Like, it takes a lot out of me doing these, particularly over the last month or so. And honestly, I'm getting towards completely exhausted doing them. I've created a kind of expectation of myself, and in my head, expectations from others, that because I said I'm going to do one every Sunday, I have to do one every Sunday. But I'm getting towards the point where it can feel like an almost unbearable weight of pressure to find time to pull stuff together for a new video every week. I absolutely intend to get to 52 of these. It's like a mission at this point. And I'm really proud of getting this far with them. But like, for my mental health, I think I need to take a bit of a break for a week or two and just replenish some spoons a bit, because I'm feeling really depleted at the moment. I'm not going to worry about people thinking I'm flaky or unreliable, or about YouTube's algorithms giving up on making my videos visible because I'm not posting regularly, or whatever it is they do. Like, what will be will be. But yeah, please do click on the little receive all notifications bell under the subscribe button so I don't disappear completely from sight if I take a week or two off from these. But I will be back once I've got a bit more energy back, and I will get up to the full 52 videos to round out my Discovery Year thing. But yeah, for the next week or so, I'm kind of shot and need a little breather from internet land. But in the meantime, do take the CAT-Q test if you haven't before. Buy Dr Hannah's book if you think the exercises would be helpful. Thank you for watching and commenting and all those nice things. And yeah, what Arnie says. Cheers for now, and see you in a bit.